Today we're going to talk about irregular comparatives and superlatives, and we're also going to talk about quam, which is a Latin word, and what we call the ablative of comparison. It's a use of the ablative. So let's get started. One of the things that you probably know is that English has irregular adjectives, that is, adjectives whose comparatives and superlatives don't follow that ER-EST model or the more-most model. And our best examples of this are best, right? So adjectives like good, we don't say gooder, goodest, or more good, most good. We say good, better, best. And the same is true for the adjective bad. We say bad, worse, worst. So these are just irregular. They just don't conform to the regular model that we have for how we can form the comparative and superlative of adjectives. And Latin is exactly the same. That is, some of these most common adjectives also have irregular comparative and superlative forms. And so although with all the other ones, with a couple of like little tiny strange things, they follow a model that is completely regular, and I could give you any adjective in the world and you could give me the comparative and superlative. With a handful of Latin adjectives, you can't do that. You just have to memorize them in the way that people who are learning English, who aren't native speakers, have to learn good, better, best, bad, worse, worst. So let's look at those examples. For bonus, right, which is our adjective that means good, we have in the comparative melior and melius, and in the superlative optimus, optima, optimum. So you can see these are just they don't look anything like bonus, and we just have to memorize them. You can see, though, that the comparatives end in IOR and IUS, so they decline in a completely regular way. So it's going to be melior, melioris, meliori, etc. And you can see that the superlative optimus has three forms just like all of the other ones. So it's optimus, optima, optimum, and those are going to decline in a completely regular way. So there's nothing strange about the forms. The strange thing is what the word actually is. You would just never guess that optimus has anything to do with bonus. The same is true for the adjective that means bad, malus. The comparative is peior, or peius in the neuter, and the superlative is pessimus, pessima, pessimum. So again, the endings are really regular, but the root is completely strange. And then we do have a handful of others that work in this same way, just like bonus and malus. Those adjectives are magnus, which means big. So although big in English is totally regular, right? Big, bigger, biggest. In Latin, it's magnus major or maius in the neuter, and maximus, maxima, maximum in the superlative. This is where we get the word major, is where we get the word major from. So if that helps you, something is big and then it's major and then it's of maximum size. So I think that we get enough words in English that make sense to us, but it's not regular in Latin, obviously. And then we also have multus, which means much, and the comparative is plus, which we'll talk about, and then the superlative is plurimus, most. So much, more, and most. And then We have parvus, which you know means small or little. And it also has these adjectives minor or minus, and then minimus, minima, minimum. And again, although these are irregular, they're not hard for an English speaker to recognize and translate. Something that is minor or minus means less, smaller. That's exactly what it is. And minimus means the smallest, the least. So those are pretty easy too, in terms of translating and identifying them in our sentences. But a little bit more about plus, which is a little strange. So plus only appears in the singular neuter, and it takes a genitive. So in the singular, we only have these neuter forms, and then we just use it with a noun to say more of, right? So for example, in Latin, you would say plus pecuniae, more money. That is literally more of money. But the form plus itself is regular as far as it goes. It's plus, pluris, pluri, etc. Right? It looks just as you would expect it to if it were an IUS form, just like peius or difficilius or something like that. And in the plural, it's an adjective that can modify things, and it has both masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. So you can see, we can say something like plures piratae, more pirates, in the masculine, or we can say plura bella, more wars. So if you want to look at these forms, they're really regular. It's just that we don't have that I for the most part, but you can find those on page 127 of your textbook. The important thing to know is that we never use plus to mean more with an adjective. So we're not going to say more bitter and say plus acer or something like that. We would use the comparative form acrius. But we use this only with nouns to talk about the number of things that we're talking about. So if I have one cat and you have more cats, you have plures feles. Okay? So that's the only thing. But you do probably want to look at those forms. Just cast an eye at them on page 127. There are also, in your textbook, there are some adjectives that don't have positive forms. Positive forms are those just regular forms, right? Good, bad, strong, weak, right? Not the ER and EST, just the regular form. There are some adjectives that have comparatives and superlatives but don't have the positive form, and those tend to be adjectives that talk about direction. These are also on page 127 of your book if you want to take a look at them. But you can see that in terms of like the endings, those are totally regular. This has an extra, I don't know why I put this extra U in there, but this has an IOR, MUS, IOR, US, IOR, US, right? Like those are super regular. The only thing you need to know is what they mean. So deterior, deterimus means worse or worst. Exterior means outer, and then extremus would be the outermost. Inferior is lower. Infimus would be the lowest. Interior is interior, right? So inner, and intimus is innermost. Posterior, you can see, is later. Postremus would be last. Prior is earlier. and primus is first. Proprior is nearer, proximus is nearest, and superior is higher, supremus highest, and ulterior is farther, ultimus is farthest. So you can see that all of these really, except for maybe deterior, all of these are talking about, right, inner versus outer, lower versus higher, later versus earlier. And a lot of these are also words where we actually use them, right? We talk about the posterior of something as being the back end of something, that is the later part of whatever we're talking about, or something that's superior is higher, it's better. So these are pretty easy, I think, again, to understand. You need to memorize the meaning and understand them when you see them, but there's really nothing to form here. This is really more about vocabulary. Finally, I want to talk just a little bit about how we translate these forms and how we use them, because that's the most important thing. So for the most part, we talked about comparatives meaning more, and superlatives meaning most, or and est. And we can see this with these example sentences I have given you here. So meus canis, this is in the nominative, est, that's our verb, and then maior, right? This is also in the nominative, modifying the canis. My dog is bigger, maior. But we can also sometimes translate the comparative in a couple of different ways. So sometimes we would say, meus canis es maior. It's rather big. That is sort of compared to other dogs. My dog is kind of big. Or we might say, meus canis es maior. It's too big. That is, compared to other dogs, it is bigger, and that is too much dog for me. Similarly, we can use this superlative in a slightly different way. So if we say, meus canis est maximus, my dog is the biggest. It's the biggest dog in the world. Or we might just mean it is a very big dog. That is, compared to all the dogs, it's pretty much one of the bigger dogs out there. It is very, very large, right? So these are variations. So sometimes if saying more or most, or est, doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense, you might want to try one of these other translations. And one of the things we tend to use comparative forms for is to compare two things. That is the meaning of the form. So what we usually do, instead of just saying, my dog is rather big, or my dog is too big, we would say, my dog is bigger than your pig. So than is one of these words that we really see a lot with comparative words in English. And in Latin, there are two different ways to express that than idea. So way number one, we can use this word quam. Quam can do a lot of different jobs in Latin, but one meaning it can have is than, and you almost always know that's what it means if you see it near a comparative. So meus canis maior quam tuus porcus est. Here you can see that the two things that are being compared, my dog and your pig, are both in the nominative. And this is the rule that you want to remember. If you're using quam, the things that you're comparing have to be in the same case. So if I said instead, habeo canem maior em quam, right, tuum porcum. I have a dog in the accusative that is bigger in the accusative than your pig, also accusative, right? Because if the dog is in the accusative, the thing it's being compared to is also going to be in the accusative. All these things are going to agree, okay? But the other thing that we can do, and this is really super, super common, is that we can just put that thing that we're comparing into the ablative. So here you can see meus canis, that is exactly the same. Est is exactly the same. Maior is exactly the same. But instead of quam tuus porcus, I just say tuo porco. My dog is bigger than your pig. And the than is just implied because we have the ablative there. And again, it's usually pretty clear because you have a comparative and you have an ablative. You know this is the ablative of comparison. The final thing that we can do with quam is that quam can also sometimes be with a superlative instead of a comparative. And when you see quam plus a superlative, it always means as blank as possible. So here, the dog is quam maximus, as big as possible. So those are the uses of quam, the use of the ablative of comparison. It's really pretty straightforward, I think. A lot of what we talked about in this is really just memorization. The forms don't change at all. So take a look at those pages in your textbook and send me any questions that you have. Okay,